Three constants in the history of civilization revolve around wars, natural catastrophes, and diseases. Disease has been caused by many factors, such as the flu, smallpox, typhus, and the plague. The plague is one of the oldest diseases that dates back all the way to the dawn of civilization. The plague is caused by bacteria. For about 3 billion years, bacteria have been the dominant life form on Earth. They long predated mammals, which only recently appeared on the scene 225 million years ago. So it's only natural that bacteria have had a long time to adapt to their surroundings, including new life forms. Now, the plague is specifically caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. DNA evidence has shown that humans were infected by the plague 5,000 years ago. After exposure, a person develops flu-like symptoms. It can also lead to a dark discoloration of the skin, which gives it its other famous name, the Black Death. There are three types of plague: the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, and the septicemic plague. The bubonic plague is mainly transmitted to humans by the bite of fleas. The primary hosts of the fleas are animals such as the black rat. The bacteria enter through the skin by the flea bite and travel to the lymph nodes, causing them to swell. Bubonic plague is only spread from animal to human. Now, the pneumonic plague usually occurs after an initial spread of the bubonic version. It is contracted by breathing in airborne droplets from another person or animal infected with the plague, but really it's mostly human-to-human contact. Pneumonic plague is given its name because the bacilli invade the lungs. This variety is highly contagious from one person to another. And finally, the septicemic plague is a bacterial infection of the blood. In recorded history, there are three main outbreaks of the plague caused by Yersinia pestis, though as I mentioned before, the infection dates back to the Stone Age. I also want to point out that the plague did not just disappear between the major plague time periods. It has always been around, it's just to what degree. In addition, even during the major phases, there were times where the plague died down greatly. Now, the first plague is also referred to as the Justinian plague, and is the least understood of the three major plagues. The first wave of the strain occurred in 541 AD under Justinian's reign, which is why it bears his name. But the plague reappeared in several other waves, all the way up to 750 AD. The pandemic likely started in Central Africa, but this is disputed, with some experts believing it actually originated from the east. In any event, the pestilence made its way north to the Egyptian port of Pelusium in 541 AD. The problem was that Egypt's main export to the rest of the Byzantine Empire was grain, and so the disease likely spread through rat-infested trade ships. Soon it showed up in Alexandria, then to Asia Minor, then on to Constantinople, and finally making its way to southern and northern Europe. The disease was so virulent that there were reports of ghost ships where the entire crew had died as a result of the plague. As always, it spread along trade and military routes, first to coastal regions, and then making its way inland. John of Ephesus is one of the main ancient chroniclers who described the wave of destruction the disease brought to city after city. Quote, "Thus it was told about one city on the Egyptian border that it perished totally and completely, with only 7 men and one little boy 10 years old remaining in it. The men, having made common cause with each other, went around the whole city and saw that there was nobody alive in it but themselves, the corpses of the rest of the people being mixed together in a decaying state. They took counsel among themselves and said, quote, 'Perhaps we shall escape from death. But since now it is easy for us, let us enter the large houses and gather for ourselves gold, silver, and whatever is in them, so that we shall fill one house. Perhaps we will survive, and so it will be ours.' End quote. They dared to enter the houses, which were rich and empty of inhabitants. For 3 days they gathered only gold and silver, and with it filled one large house. On the 3rd day they were carrying the booty and entering the house. There, inside the house, God's wrath came upon them. Immediately they fell, and all of them, except that little boy within 1 hour, perished on top of the booty they had gathered." End quote. John of Ephesus also describes the carnage in Constantinople. Quote, "It happened that 5,000 and 7,000, or even 12,000, and as many as 16,000 of them departed this world in a single day. Since thus far it was only the beginning. Men were standing by the harbors, at the crossroads, and at the gates counting the dead, Here was nobody to stand and do his job, with the result that food vanished from the markets. Only a few were strong enough to bring anything to the bazaar. Thus everything ceased and stopped. What was most pressing of all was simply that everybody who was still alive should remove corpses from his house, and that all the other corpses should disappear from the streets by being removed to the seashore. There, boats were filled with them, and during each sailing they were thrown overboard, and the ships returned to take other corpses." End quote. John of Ephesus even went on to describe the wave of destruction caused in the countryside to villages. Quote, "Still others who had totally disappeared, having left their homes void of inhabitants. Staging posts on the roads full of darkness and solitude, filling with fright everyone who had happened to enter and leave them. Cattle abandoned, and roaming scattered over the mountains with nobody to gather them. Flocks of sheep, goats, oxen, and pigs, which had become like wild animals, having forgotten a cultivated land and the human voice which used to lead them." End quote. No one knows how many people died as a result of the first plague pandemic. John of Ephesus states that there were so many corpses that the few that survived simply stopped counting. Modern estimates place the death toll between 30 and 50 million. The most famous plague outbreak in history was the Black Death. It marked the beginning of the second plague pandemic. The origins of the Black Death and its outbreak remain unclear, but the general consensus is that this new strain of the plague originated from the east. The first reports of the plague came from the port city of Kaffa in the Crimean Peninsula. The city was under the control of the maritime empire Genoa, but the Mongols had laid siege to the port in 1347. The turning point in the siege came when the plague struck the Mongol camp. It is believed to have been spread by the infected rodents and fleas that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of the camp. The Mongol forces were forced to break off the siege, but not before doing the unthinkable. They decided to catapult the plague-infected bodies of their dead soldiers as weapons. This is considered to be one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. Not surprisingly, the Black Death quickly spread among the city's population. The panic-stricken residents quickly boarded ships and headed to Constantinople. From there, the plague spread to North Africa, the Middle East, and the rest of Europe via Sicily and the Italian peninsula. As in any major event, especially plagues, people turned to religion for answers. Adherents would repent their sins and wrongdoings to what they saw as a wrathful god. Cults also began to spring up. One particular group of note were the flagellants. The followers were noted for including public flagellation in their rituals. The Catholic Church condemned the group as heretics. Another group that appeared were the plague doctors, made more famous for their strange appearance. Many wore a special costume consisting of an overcoat and a bird-like beaked mask. The mask was said to purify the air they breathed. They not only treated patients, but also compiled public records of plague deaths. In some cases, they were even asked to perform autopsies. Those that had the means and money attempted to escape the plague by traveling to more remote areas, though many nobles still died from the disease as it consumed almost all of Europe. One of the last major events was the Great Plague of London, which occurred from 1665 to 1666. In under 2 years, it killed an estimated 100,000 people, which was almost a quarter of London's population. During the Middle Ages, overcrowding in towns made it easy for the plague to spread, especially in the poorer sections of cities. Since many of these houses were overcrowded, hygiene was impossible to maintain. There was often no sanitation, and open drains flowed from the sides of slippery cobblestone streets. With sewage and waste building up, it was a perfect breeding ground for rats and fleas. The plague repeatedly returned to haunt Europe and the Mediterranean, mainly throughout the 14th and 17th centuries. The same strain returned on and off again, all the way up until the 19th century. It is estimated that the second plague pandemic killed between 75 and 200 million people. There has also been a lot of ongoing research into the spread of the Black Death during the Middle Ages. Some recent evidence points to lice as causing the spread as well as fleas and rats. In addition, once the large urban areas were infected, it's believed that the rapid spread was a result of pneumonic plague rather than the bubonic version, because of close human-to-human contact. The third plague pandemic began in China in 1855, but medical research was beginning to catch up. In 1894, the offending bacterium was finally identified. A few years later, the first plague vaccine was developed and administered. The improvement in sanitary conditions in the 20th century, as well as antibiotics, greatly increased human lifespans. But cases of the disease are still reported today, and experts are worried about the potential of another huge plague pandemic. New vaccines are currently being developed and tested for new strains that arise.